Hello, my name's Kurt Harris. I'm here to give a lecture entitled Australian English, a Fair Dinkum History. Gonna share my screen here, work through a bunch of slides, so you don't have to look at me. You have to listen to me, but you don't have to look at me. Pull the Canva up here. Here we go. As I said, I'm Kurt Harris. I'm the Director of Learning Abroad. I'm also an Associate Professor of English at SUU. I'm not Australian, obviously, but I lived in Australia for about 7 weeks in 2014. I was a recipient of an Australia Endeavour Award. It was a fellowship. So I visited our partner university there, CQ University, Central Queensland University. I was in Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, and Rockhampton, and kind of fell in love with the place. This lecture is going to focus on the development of the Australian English dialect. The first half of my talk is about the accent, where it came from, what it sounds like, how it developed. And the second half of my lecture is going to be about some of the unique vocabulary. I can't cover all of the words unique to Australian English, but I'll talk about a lot of them. I won't use a whole lot of technical terms. This is just kind of a general overview. And I'm assuming you've probably looked through Bill O'Neill's PowerPoint by this point. So you know some of the history of Australia. You know how to locate it on a map, I hope. And you might have listened to some of the audio, so you've probably heard some of the Australian accent, but I'm going to play a news clip. It's a guy named Daniel McConnell. He's being interviewed by a local reporter in Brisbane. And I'd like you to listen closely to the way Daniel speaks. See if you can discern a difference between his speech and what you're used to, kind of some of the differences in the sounds, and also between the way he speaks, the guy who's being interviewed, Daniel McConnell, and the way the reporter speaks. Get this going.
Oh, well, it's really quite funny. I was in bed sleeping at 2 o'clock this morning. My wife comes in and says, "Oh, the shop's been, someone ran into the shop." And I said, "Oh, what?" So I jumped out of bed and all I had was my undies on, and I walked out the front and I've seen the car smashed, and I've seen the bloke walking back to the car. And so I walked outside and I said, "Oh, what are you doing, mate? Like, you can't be leaving the scene." And he goes, "Don't be a hero, mate." And I said, "I'm not trying to be a hero, but the police are coming." And he just decided he'd scoot up the road, and I just said, "Nah, it's not going on like that, mate." So I jumped in my car and I started chasing him up the road, and then he went down a side street, and then the police were coming, and I flashed them and sent them off in the direction of him. But, mate, all I had was my jocks on, and I was chasing him up the street, and I'm just like, "Mate, like..."
Because you told me that this is your mate's shop,
Yeah.
and you didn't want him to get away.
Yeah, no. Well, my mate's mum's had this shop for like 40 odd years, and look at it. Well,
It's a mess, isn't it?
beyond a mess. Oh, like, words can't explain how it is, mate. Like,
Now, Daniel, you managed to put some pants on in the meantime.
yeah, mate.
It's good to hear. Do you feel like a hero?
Oh, not really. It's just something you got to do for the community, mate. It's like you look after your mates, and your mates will always look after you.
There you go. Good attitude. There you go, guys. Daniel, quite the Australian hero here this morning. As for the owners of the fish and chip shop, well, they are insured, but there is a big mess to clean up this morning.
Oh, wouldn't you like to live next door to Daniel?
Thanks a lot.
Jess, what Daniel needs to realise, Daniel, if you can hear me, you know all good superheroes wear their jocks on the outside, so it kind of fits the brief,
Yeah.
pardon the pun.
Yeah, but I had nothing on bar me jocks. Yeah, Lisa.
Well, you missed that bit of the uniform, but that's okay. You're a hero in our eyes.
Wow.
Well done, Daniel.
Okay, that's Daniel the superhero, Aussie superhero. So a couple of things to think about here. I'll get into this slide in a minute, but Uh, you might be wondering, do they consciously talk that way? To borrow the words of Daniel McConnell, not really. If I want to speak with an Australian accent, I have to consciously think about the sounds, but certainly you don't think about the way you sound. If you go somewhere else, if you go to Australia, you're the one with the accent. Okay, hope that makes sense. In any case, Daniel speaks in what would be described as a broad dialect. There are kind of three categories along the spectrum: broad, general, and cultivated Australian English dialects. And Daniel would be a broad, kind of at one extreme. Cultivated would be more like British, what's called received pronunciation. Some people might call it proper English. I wouldn't call it that. It's just it's a different way of speaking. And then between those two extremes, between broad and cultivated, is general. Most Australians speak a general dialect. The reporters you heard speak a general dialect. But to get kind of an extreme, I'm focusing on Daniel and his broad accent. You will hear, if you go to Australia, people speaking like him, certainly. In the next few slides, the accents, the words that I've picked out of Daniel's speech, I've overemphasized just a little bit, perhaps. You might have heard, if you listen closely, if you go back to this video later, sometimes he uses the word mate and pronounces it mate, or closer to mate. Sometimes it's closer to might. Me might, it's me might shop. Sorry, I don't do a great Australian accent. There's kind of a shift there. I said I wasn't going to use many technical terms, but there's something called hyper articulation when somebody's trying to be more formal. So for example, when Daniel says mate, that's hyper articulation. Hypo articulation is more casual. What he would say around his friends, he would say might, more like might rather than mate. But these vowel sounds are different, frequently spoken differently in Australia than they are here in the United States, in Utah in particular. Of course, we have different accents across the United States. But the sounds, mate, for example, frequently sounds like might. It's a shift in the mouth from mate to might, from kind of forward to back in the mouth. He says quite, sounds like quite a little bit. His wife, me wife woke me up. We would say wife. Like becomes loik, decided becomes decided. Outside, he went outside. A few others, bed shifts kind of in the mouth. The vowel sounds a little bit more like bid. I was in my bid. The car, they don't roll their R's perhaps quite as much as we do here. It's in the car. Maybe sounds a little bit more like a Boston accent. The O sound frequently takes on a little bit of an ow sound. Again, it's a move forward in the mouth of the tongue. Bloke comes bloke. Again, that's a little bit of an exaggeration. He was sleeping, he was slaping, he was laving. Clane, he uses the word clane, straight, to talk about the street. And then when they ask him if he's a superhero or if it feels like a superhero, he says, not really. Again, just a few differences, mainly in the vowel sounds. As we do here, people frequently drop the kind of the final G in an ing word. We don't say sleeping all the time. I was sleeping. I was leaving. That's similar to here. So did this accent all come from one place, you might wonder. Not really. It came from Britain for the most part, which is kind of one place, but came from lots of different areas of Britain. In Britain, there isn't just one accent. I'll play a clip in a minute of different British accents kind of moving around the British island. And you'll hear these differences. So it's not as if a bunch of people came from London, for example, settled in Australia, and people in Australia speak with the accent of the people of London. There's a theory behind where it came from. British and Irish accents for the most part. So here's the video I mentioned.
Received pronunciation is the Great Communicator. As soon as you deviate from that and you go into London speech, for example, then you lose a little bit of the communication. Cockney is based on East Anglian, Suffolk, Norfolk, Cambridgeshire. This is often by actors confused with the West Country, where the R's come in, and then you get Dorset and Somerset, get into Cornwall. Devon's slightly different, it goes into the nose bit more like that. Then you go up north to Yorkshire. It's nice if you get a word that's got one of the predominant sounds in it, like Yorkshire. Then you cross the Pennines into Lancashire, where it gets much more flexible and fluid in the mouth. Liverpool is there too, you know, it's Scouse, it's a mixture of all kinds of sounds. One of those is Northern Irish with the raising inflections, but you don't get the raising inflections down in Dublin, where it has that poetic quality, which is sometimes thought of as being not different from Highland speech, which is also quite poetic and almost Scandinavian. And then you come down to Glasgow and into the lowlands of Scotland, where you get glottal stops and things like that. Then you come down the west coast and you're in Wales, North Wales, where it's breathy like that, and down into South Wales, where you get much heavier, and Welsh people who sometimes even sound a bit drunk.
Okay. Welsh people sound a bit drunk. I don't know about that, but so the accents came from, the Australian accent came from lots of different accents. And I like to kind of think of it as the Australian accent as developing sort of, think of a funnel. And if you pour in a bunch of different colors from the rim of the funnel, and each of the colors is one of these accents from Britain and Ireland, they'll all kind of swirl together into one and come out the bottom, perhaps in kind of a muddy mess. I don't mean to say that the Australian accent is a muddy mess, but it's a mix of all these different beautiful colors, and it becomes its own beautiful accent. One way to describe it. So did this come about all at once? Not really. There are several theories about how the Australian accent developed, and the one that seems to have kind of risen to the top, or the one that's supported the most, is based on there's a man named Trudgill, a linguist, and it's Trudgill's theory of dialect mixing. And the idea is that, as you know, in 1788, Botany Bay was first settled. The British settled Botany Bay. So the first group of immigrants arrived in Botany Bay with all these different accents. But some, what's called leveling, dialect leveling and accommodation, probably occurred on the ship over. And as waves of British and Irish came to Australia, before they even got there, a lot of the dialect differences had begun to break down in a a book by Clemens Fritz. There's a quotation that kind of describes this. Let me just read it quickly. The accounts of shipboard life suggest that the mixing and physical proximity of people on board to some extent dissolved their old social relationships and disposed them to accept more readily the egalitarian and tolerant Australian environment. The ship was, in some important ways, the colony in microcosm. It prefigures the erosion of class and religious barriers, and the length of the voyage disrupted traditional life patterns and hastened the collapse of old practices, particularly in relation to religion and social authority. In contrast with the shorter trip to America, the interminable voyage to Australia wrought subtle sea changes in the migrant disposition. So all these different dialects, these different accents from Britain and Ireland started to break down a bit on the way to Australia. So this first group of immigrants had already started the formation, unknowingly, obviously, the formation of the what came to be the Australian accent. And it's believed, again, this is Treadgill's theory, that dialect leveling and accommodation so that people could understand each other, the extreme variants within their speech were eliminated or kind of weeded out. And when the first the first generation of Australian English speakers were born, they among themselves, among their peers, sort of established that the new accent. That was, right around 1810, 1820, somewhere in there. And then, again, according to Treadgill's theory, with the second generation, that's when what's called the foundation accent is established. The immigrants come, they have children. Those children, there's some dialect leveling and accommodation made so that they can all understand each other. And then when they grow up and they have children, that's when the accent is established. So somewhere in the 1840s, it's believed the Australian accent, as we kind of know it today, for the most part, was established. And you might be wondering, are there regional dialects in Australia? It's a big country. Again, if you saw Bill O'Neill's PowerPoint, you saw the overlay of the island of Australia, the land of Australia, over the United States. And you might think, well, people in Sydney probably speak differently than people in Perth, for example, or Darwin or Cairns. It's a big country, and maybe similar to the way people in New York City sound different from Nolens, Louisiana, or St. Paul, Minnesota. We have different regional dialects, and you can kind of know that somebody's from Boston versus somebody from, I don't know, St. George, Utah. In Australia, some people can hear different dialects, different accents, but for the most part, people in Australia have largely the same accent. There is, as I mentioned earlier, kind of different categories. There's broad, general, and cultivated. I talked about those already. Let me show you a short video, and I'm going to move up to just show a clip. I can remember where it was. I think it's right about here, that explains a little bit this concept of broad, general, and cultivated. Give some examples. And then there's a more recent shift that this nice lady will talk about. This will last only about 20 or 30 seconds. If I can get it to work.
No, there is no one Australian accent. There are three general groupings of the accent: cultivated, broad, and general.
Without spoiling, it ends with possibility.
And here's this bloke from the bush up in Beerwah, Queensland.
But nowadays, those definitions aren't really adequate, as we've shifted towards a more general accent. A better way to group the accent would be Standard Australian, Aboriginal English, and Ethno-Cultural Australian English.
Sometimes we take those things for granted.
Helen picked a good spot near the water and spent the morning surfing and relaxing in the sun.
That last one reflects the fact that everyone has an idiolect. Your own accent is shaped by the history of where you've lived and who you've grown up with, so we all sound a bit different from each other. But there are plenty of common traits.
Okay. Idiolects. Sorry, we don't have time to get into idiolects. So there are no regional dialects, and there's a theory behind why that is. As big as Australia is, how is it that people don't sound different from each other in different regions? And scholars believe it's kind of a matter of timing. As I said, the Australian accent was really kind of established in the second generation of Australian English speakers in the 1840s, and then in the 1850s, the gold rush, or the gold rushes, actually happened in Australia, and that spread this accent, which really was predominant around the Sydney area. That was the main settled area. It's called the Sydney Mixing Bowl by some. And then the gold rush hit, and the Sydney dialect spread kind of in a counterclockwise manner around the country. Let's look at a map. If you look here, Melbourne and Sydney down in the southeast corner, 1851. This is when gold rush sites were discovered, and people flocked to these areas because they wanted to strike it rich in the gold fields. And then more gold fields were discovered up here. So a lot of these people, when the gold mines ran out, they moved up here and they took their speech patterns with them. 1867, so we moved from 1851 to 1867. Charter Towers, 1871, 1882. So every kind of 15 years or so, people were moving. And then over here, we moved from 1871, 1882 to 1886 to Western Australia. And then down here in the 1890s, obviously these weren't all the same people just taking their accent around, but it's believed that this is kind of how the accent that really became predominant in this area moved all the way around Australia. And so that there is really, other than the broad, general, and cultivated differences, there's really kind of only one Australian accent. So by the late 1800s, when the accent was really kind of established throughout the country, Australians at this point were kind of thinking about nationhood. Should they split from the United Kingdom? Should they become a republic or a federation? And many were becoming, really proud of their Australian heritage as distinct from the motherland. Some people still talked of home. They used the term home referring to Great Britain when they had never been to Great Britain before, but that was still considered the homeland. That was changing throughout the 1800s. By the late 1800s, many Australians were looking to form a nation. So what did the British think of this Australian accent that had developed? Well, this is a man named William Churchill. This isn't Winston Churchill, but kind of in the early 1900s wrote this. The fact remains that the common speech of the Commonwealth of Australia represents the most brutal maltreatment which has ever been inflicted upon the language that is the mother tongue of the great English nations. So A lot of the British looked down on the Australians, just as they looked down on the Americans. I use the term Poms here. That's a term that Australians developed in Australia to refer to the British as they were coming in, particularly the kind of the posh, the more wealthy British who came to Australia. Not to get too far into it, but these immigrants, some of them were called Jimmy Grants, kind of to make fun of them because they didn't know the ways of the Australians, and some were called Pomegrants, or like pomegranates. And the Pomegrants, immigrants, were kind of the upper class British. Anyway, they call them Poms. So that's really enough about the Australian accent. What about vocabulary? See, I'm running a little bit short on time, so I'm going to rush through this. You can come back to it. Did the vocabulary of Australia, some of the unique words, come from one place? I think the obvious answer to that is no, not really. There were Aboriginal languages in Australia when the white people first arrived. There were over 250 different languages, distinct languages, over 800 dialects within those languages. Today, it's believed there are only about 13 native speakers of the native Aboriginal languages. A lot of the vocabulary, most of it came from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, but I'll give a few examples of Aboriginal languages. Certainly, it's probably kind of obvious when the white settlers arrived, they came upon some animals they had never seen before, so they adopted the kind of the local words: kangaroo, koala, kookaburra. It's kind of a funny bird in Australia. Those words came from various Aboriginal languages. The wombat, the wallaby, galahs, dingoes, those are all animals in Australia. And those words have made their way into slang terms, really, sometimes, or ways of describing things. So a wombat crossing, if you know what a wombat is, it kind of burrows under the ground. They're burrowing animals, they kind of leave humps, but a wombat crossing is like a raised speed bump for a pedestrian crossing. That's a wombat crossing. If somebody's on the wallaby, that's typically used of what the Australians also call grey nomads. The wallaby's a grey animal, and retirees who are traveling around are on the wallaby, traveling around like a wallaby. If someone is a bloke's as mad as a gum tree full of galahs, he's kind of crazy. Mad meaning crazy, not meaning angry. A gum tree is like a eucalyptus tree in Australia, and galahs are comical birds. So if there are a whole bunch of these comical birds in a eucalyptus tree, you get the idea there. He's mad as a gum tree full of galahs. And if a bloke is called a dingo, back when in the 1800s, dingo, if somebody was compared to a dingo, they were thought of as cowardly. And today, if a bloke's a dingo, that refers to an older man who likes to try to pick up younger women. He's a dingo. Don't be a dingo. Just a few other words from the languages of the first peoples of Australia. Billabong, it's like a watering hole. Brits hadn't, certainly there are ponds and things in Britain, but when they came, they weren't used to seeing kind of places where rivers had dried up and left just kind of water in a low area. But that was a billabong. It's kind of a watering hole or a pond made from a dried up river. Boomerang, everybody knows what a boomerang is. Yakka, you might not know what yakka is. That's from an Aboriginal language as well. Let's have my good friend Margot tell you what yakka is, along with a few other words. I won't play the whole thing, but here's Margot Robbie.
Hi, I'm Margot Robbie, and I'm going to teach you some Aussie slang. Bludger. Okay, a bludger is like someone who's lazy. Third income, kind of like, oh, far out. Good on you. Oh, good on you, mate. Like that. So he's a ripper of a party. Or he's a ripper of a bloke. Good. Hard yakka? Hard yakka's like hard work. I've never used the word dukalaki in my life. I have no idea what it means. Oh, so if you...
Okay. Sorry, Margot, got to shut you down. I think I went past. Okay. So a bludger, she mentions a bludger. A bludger was originally someone who was in England, a lazy pimp, to be quite honest, somebody who lived off the work of others, but that was a bludger. That word came over from Britain. And as you said today, it's a lazy person, kind of a slouch, a slacker. Fair dinkum. The first Australians I met used the term fair dinkum, and I had no idea what it meant. That was back when I was an exchange student, when I was 18 years old. I had some friends who were Australians, and they said fair dinkum a lot. And I loved it, but I wasn't ever really sure what it meant. It actually comes from the Lincolnshire dialect, Lincolnshire, Derbyshire, England. And it meant to do your fair share of work. And today it's used in different contexts, as my good friend Margot Robbie said, can mean far out, just as an exclamation. Oh, we went to a party yesterday. Oh, fair dinkum. Or it can mean kind of like, really, seriously, fair dinkum, fair dinkum. Or as an adjective, excellent or genuine, fair dinkum. As the title of this lecture, right? A fair dinkum history of Australian English. Good on ya, that comes from Ireland. Well done. Believed to have come over with the Irish. That had its origins there. A ripper. Used in London in the 1820s. It's in print to describe London as a ripper of a town. It's an amazing thing. So if a party's a ripper, it's amazing. Just a few other kind of uniquely Australian words. You might have heard of the bush. It's not only used in Australia, but also in Africa to refer not to like a shrub, which, if we look at a plant and call it a bush, that's what the British would have used the term bush for. So the term bush in Australia didn't come from England. It probably came from the Dutch, from Holland, the Netherlands. You probably know that Australia was first discovered, I guess, by Europeans, by the Dutch in the 1600s, just kind of the northern part. They didn't settle it, but Bosch, kind of similar to bush, is a Dutch word meaning uncultivated land, forest lands, land that hasn't been cultivated. And so it's kind of sparse vegetation land. Outback, you probably know already that Outback Steakhouse isn't really isn't an Australian company, but we hear the term Outback. It's a combination of terms that kind of melded into Outback. People refer to the back country and to the outside country. People in Australia living along the coasts, the habitable areas, that's actually kind of referred to as the inside, and the outside, or the outback, is the vast kind of desert lands in the interior. But kind of a combination of back country and outside country became outback. Swag. The term swag initially came from convicts what's called flash language in the early 1800s. And it meant something that was stolen, kind of anything from jewelry to clothing to kind of smaller articles, but not money was swag. If you had some swag, it was something stolen. And then later, kind of gold miners and stockmen or ranchers in their language in the later 1800s, it meant a bundle of belongings that you take with you from town to town, from station to station. Today, it means the gear that you take camping with you, a bedroll. But it began as a kind of a convict term. You didn't call them convicts back then. They were either government men or public servants, sometimes they were called. But swag was a convict term. Just a few others. Sheila. Don't ever call a woman a Sheila. You might think, oh, well, that just means a woman in Australia. Well, it sort of came from the Irish Gaelic originally, just meaning woman. And for many years, it was just kind of generic, kind of the female version of a bloke. But now it's considered kind of derogatory, perhaps similar to bogan, which is, I don't know, kind of more white trash, like an ochre or a larrikin, but it's unsophisticated. Maybe another term similar in the U.S. might be redneck, white trash, but don't call a woman a Sheila. A digger, excuse me, originated in the gold rush days. A miner was a digger, and then in World War I, the soldiers who dug trenches in Europe were diggers, and then the word developed to a meaning that was more like mate or friend, kind of a term of endearment among men, digga. And then a dag. If someone is a dag, they're kind of a nerd or an unfashionable person. Something's daggy. It's kind of not fashionable. It's worn out. That term came from sheep stations, from sheep herders. And if you know what, maybe kind of in American English, what a dingleberry is, it's kind of the nasty thing that hangs on the back of the fleece of a sheep's rear end. Dingleberry, that's what a dag is originally. But now it means somebody who's kind of a nerd, unfashionable. Okay, trying to wind things up here. I think I'm just about out of time. Some Australian slang. Need to learn the language before you go. Sarvo, bottle-o, stubby, esky. If I say something like, Sarvo, I'm going to the bottle-o to get some stubbies. I'll put them in an esky in the back of me ute. Hope the mozzies ain't thick. Translation of that would be, Sarvo, this afternoon, I'm going to the liquor store, to the bottle-o, to get some bottled beer, some stubbies. I'll put them in a cooler, in an esky, in the back of my truck. A ute is a pickup truck, utility vehicle, ute. And mozzies are mosquitoes. I hope the mozzies ain't thick, aren't bad. So that's your Australian vocabulary lesson. Spelling and grammar pretty much follows British spelling. So there's a U where we would just have OR. Center is RE instead of ER. Enroll with only one O. Fulfill with one L at the end. Fulfillment, enrollment. Apologize, ISE instead of IZE. So quick review, the accent developed in the early 1800s. Different dialects were leveled out. The Australian accent was established by the second generation of Australian English speakers around 1840. Not spread around the country with the gold rush through the end of the century when national pride was growing. And with regard to the vocabulary, that grew really in the latter half of the 1800s. Some of the words had come from the Aboriginal languages, mainly the unique animals, and then more frequently from the British and Irish immigrants. the settlers and gold miners and stockmen or ranchers. So a few dictionaries you might check out if you're interested. The first real Australian dictionary, 1898. You might know that in the U.S., Webster's dictionary was 1828, also kind of a time of growing nationalism. Excuse me. References that I used for this presentation. There's an excellent website, Macquarie University's Australian Voices. You can find that. Also online is Clemens Fritz's Early Australian Letters, a linguistic analysis, and then our library has a book, an excellent, really easy to read, a very informative book by Bruce Moore called Speaking Our Language, The Story of Australian English. And then I read novels a lot as an English professor, and I've read quite a few novels written by Australians, and these 5 I highly recommend. Relatively contemporary novels set for the most part in Australia, uses a lot of what we would consider Australian language, very colorful, highly recommended. And Tim Winton was one of my favorite Australian writers. And when he was receiving an award once, he said this. He was born in 1960, so kind of grew up in the 60s, 70s. It says, "The cultural cringe died a long, slow death while I was a kid." It's the Australian English culture. "I was a beneficiary of a new optimism and confidence in Australia. Australian writers began to be honored at home and to be treated as equals abroad. I feel incredibly lucky to have come of age in a country that honors its own stories and accents." That's Tim Winton. So if you have any questions about this, email me. I'm at harrisk@scu.edu. If you were Daniel McConnell or some other Australian who'd been sitting through this lecture, you might say to me, "Mate, the dog's is pissing on your swag." What does that mean? That means I've overstayed my welcome in Australian, and so I have. So I would say to you in reply, "Fair dinkum, good on you, mate. Thanks for listening."